Sniper! Ah! Get down!
The lights flicker once,
Window!
just
Bullets!
once.
Get down!
And in that half-second of darkness, a sniper exhales, settles his weight, and presses his eye to the scope. He's already found his target. Across 130 feet of open night air, through a rain-streaked glass wall, a man stands on a rooftop terrace. Silver-haired, straight-backed, completely unaware that he is already in the crosshairs. Kyung-Jun Choi, the most feared name in the Korean underworld. And right now, he is seconds from dying. Nobody in that room sees it coming. Nobody except the woman in the corner. The one nobody looked at twice. The photographer. Before this goes any further, look at her. Really look. Because everybody else in that room already made the mistake of not looking. Drop in the comments right now. Did you clock her from the jump? Or did she already fool you? The smartest people watching already know something is wrong. Let's find out who's paying attention. The Siorax Summit did not exist on paper. No calendar listing, no press coverage, no public record of any kind. It existed the way most dangerous things exist. Quietly, beneath the surface, known only to those already inside the current. 43 guests. One private penthouse floor. 3 rival Korean syndicate families gathered under one roof for the first time in history, agreeing to dissolve their territorial wars and fold their operations beneath a single, unified hierarchy. Kyung-Jun Choi's hierarchy. 61 years old, silver-haired, charcoal suit worth more than most people's yearly salary. He moved through that room the way generals move through old battlefields. Not with urgency, but with ownership. He shook hands slowly, smiled rarely, and when he spoke, every person in that room leaned in. Not because he was loud, because he was never loud. His inner circle called him Harabeoji, grandfather, not out of affection, but out of a fear so deeply embedded it had become something resembling reverence. Tonight was supposed to be the crowning moment of 30 years of survival. But that wasn't even the most dangerous part. Because at the edge of the room, dressed in black, holding a camera, stood Layla Osei Jackson, 29 years old, freelance photojournalist, contracted 3 weeks prior by the event's surface-level cultural cover organization. She moved through the penthouse like background music. Present, functional, invisible. Here is what every guest saw when they looked at her. A hired vendor, a brown-skinned woman doing a job, blending into the furniture of the evening. Here is what Layla was actually doing. Mapping. Every exit, every sightline. And the narrow ledge on floor 38 of the building directly opposite. Barely wide enough for a man lying flat with a rifle. She had identified it her first night on the job. 3 weeks ago. Nobody moved toward Kyung-Jun. Nobody spoke. Nobody raised an alarm. Because nobody else in that room was watching what Layla was watching. At 10:52 p.m., Kyung-Jun raised his glass. Slow, theatrical. The kind of toast a powerful man makes when he believes the world is finally arranged exactly as he wants it. And across 130 feet of dark, wet air, Siorax exhaled. Settled. Began the final phase of his trigger pull. Layla raised her camera. Not toward Kyung-Jun. Toward the glass wall. Toward the building opposite. Toward the exact ledge she had identified on her first night, and she fired her flash. One single burst of white light. Blazing, precise, and perfectly aimed. Crossed the gap between buildings like a small, silent lightning bolt and hit Siorax directly in the eye. The shot never came. Siorax recoiled, vision destroyed, body scraping backward on the ledge, rifle clattering sideways into the dark. Kyung-Jun finished his toast, set down his glass, and turned. The room felt it before anyone understood it. A shift in atmosphere, a sudden tightening, the way air changes before a storm arrives. Guards straightened, hands moved toward weapons. Eyes swept the terrace looking for the source of something they couldn't name. Kyung-Jun found Layla already looking at him, not with fear, not with triumph, with recognition. And then, across the terrace, he looked at Bora Shin, his most trusted enforcer, 11 years at his right hand, the man who had stood beside him through every war, every negotiation, every silence. Bora Shin's eyes moved, just once, just briefly, toward the building opposite, one fraction of a second too long. This was the moment that sealed everything. Kyung-Jun Choi, the man who had survived 30 years by reading rooms, had just read the most important room of his life, and the woman who made it possible was already walking toward the door. She fired a camera flash across 130 feet of open night air, and she calculated it 3 weeks before it happened. No weapon, no backup, no hesitation. The comments right now are either or, and if you're not dropping one, you weren't paying attention. Hit that like button too, because the algorithm buries stories like this. And Layla deserves to be seen. She handed him a card. Plain white. One number. No name. And she said, quietly, evenly, in perfect Korean, "You have 48 hours, Mr. Choi. Prosecutor Kwak is a patient woman, but she is not a permanent one." Then she walked past Bora Shin, past Do-hyun Seo, past every armed man on that terrace who had spent the entire evening never once looking at her, and she was gone. The room stayed frozen for 3 full seconds after she left. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved, because nobody knew what had just happened, except the one man, standing at the center of it all, holding a plain white card, realizing for the first time in 30 years that he had not been in control of his own evening. Kyung-Jun Choi did not chase her. He turned slowly, deliberately, and looked at Bora Shin. And that was the moment Bora Shin made his second mistake, because his eyes moved, just once, just briefly, toward the building opposite, one fraction of a second too long. It was the smallest tell in the world. It was enough. Kyung-Jun didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't signal a single guard. He simply looked at Bora Shin the way a man looks at something already finished. Not with rage, but with the cold, quiet calculation of someone deciding how and when, not whether. 30 years of survival had been built on exactly this skill. Reading the room after everyone else had stopped looking. However, what Kyung-Jun didn't know yet, what he couldn't know, was that Layla hadn't just saved his life tonight. She had restructured his entire world without touching a single thing in it. And the 48 hours she had just given him wasn't a warning. It was a leash. But that wasn't even the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part was that he was already thinking about calling the number. He called. Not because he trusted her. Kyung-Jun Choi had not trusted anyone in 30 years. He called because the alternative, moving against Bora Shin blind, without understanding the full architecture of the betrayal, was the kind of mistake that finished empires. And he had not survived this long by finishing his own. Layla chose the meeting location, a sterile safe house. No windows facing the street, no staff, no record of the address in any system he could trace. The fact that she had a location like this ready told him everything he needed to know about how long she had been preparing for this moment. She was already seated when he arrived. No camera this time. She laid it out clean, fast, and without softening a single edge. Bora Shin had contracted the assassination through a middleman. That middleman, believing Layla was only a layout photographer, had unknowingly placed inside the room the one person built to stop it. The entire hit had collapsed because of a single miscalculation in Bora Shin's chain. Kyung-Jun listened without interrupting. He was a man who had built an empire on reading people, on finding the fracture point in anyone who sat across from him. He searched for hers. He found nothing. She gave him information the way a surgeon works. Precise, clean, no unnecessary movement. At this point, you're probably thinking he took control of that meeting. He didn't. She was already 17 moves ahead. And the most unsettling part wasn't that she knew his operation's weaknesses better than his own lieutenants did. It was that she had chosen, so far, not to use them. Yet. She walked into his world with no weapon, no title, no backup. And she's sitting across from the most dangerous man in the Korean underworld, holding all the cards. And she hasn't even played her hand yet. If this story is hitting different, subscribe right now. Because every story on this channel is built exactly like Layla. Calculated, cold, and impossible to forget. Kyung-joon thought he was walking into a briefing. He wasn't. He was walking into a controlled demolition. And Layla was the one holding the charges. She didn't ease into it. No small talk. No posturing. She opened a folder, slid it across the table, and let the contents do the work. Bora Shin hadn't acted alone. The middleman he used to contract Cheol Ryong had a name. A low-level logistics broker who moved between syndicate families, selling access and information to whoever paid cleanest. That broker had needed a floor plan of the penthouse, photographs, sight lines, angles. He had sourced those photographs through a cultural foundation cover that regularly contracted freelance photographers for private events. He had sourced Layla. He believed she was exactly what she appeared to be, a hired vendor with a camera, there to document the evening and disappear. What he never knew, what Bora Shin never thought to verify, was who Layla actually worked for before the foundation ever called her. Prosecutor Somi Kwak. 7 years building a federal case against every family at that table, and she needed Kyung-joon Choi alive, not out of mercy, out of strategy. A dead Kyung-joon was a closed file. A living, suddenly vulnerable, freshly compromised Kyung-joon was something far more valuable. A witness. Kyung-joon sat with that for a long moment. The man who had never been outmaneuvered was processing the fact that his rescue had been engineered by a federal prosecutor who needed him breathing specifically to dismantle everything he had built. He had been saved in order to be used. And the woman sitting across from him, calm, unreadable, waiting, had known that from the moment she walked into the penthouse. However, what Layla hadn't told him yet was the part that changed everything. She hadn't decided yet whether Kwak's plan was the one she was actually running. Hold on. She was sent by a prosecutor who wants to destroy him, and she saved him anyway. So whose side is she actually on? Because right now, even Layla hasn't answered that question. Drop in the comments. Do you trust her, or is she just running a longer game on everyone in the room? I need to know what you think. Because what comes next is going to change your answer completely. Kyung-joon made a decision that surprised even his closest remaining lieutenants. He didn't touch Bora Shin. Not yet. Every instinct he had. 30 years of survival instinct. Screamed to move fast, move hard, and remove the threat before it breathed again. That was how he had always operated. That was how men like him stayed alive. But Layla told him to wait. And for the first time in his life, Kyung-joon Choi listened to someone else's read of the room. The logic was precise. A visible move against Bora Shin. An execution, a disappearance, anything sudden would fracture the three-family consolidation before the ink on those ceremonial documents was even dry. The rival families would read it as internal collapse. 2 of them were already watching for any sign that Kyung-joon's unified hierarchy was unstable. 1 wrong move and 18 months of negotiation dissolved overnight. So instead, Layla built a mirror. She advised Kyung-joon to keep Bora Shin exactly where he was. Close, trusted on the surface, completely unaware the trap had already closed around him. Every move Bora Shin made from that point forward became intelligence. Every contact, every communication, every subtle signal to the rival families. All of it fed directly back to Layla's read of how deep the betrayal ran. This became known as the silent audit. 3 days where Kyung-joon ran his empire with a traitor still inside it, by design, because the woman advising him understood that a caged threat reveals more than a dead one. and Bora Shin revealed plenty. But here is what made this phase truly dangerous. Kyung-jun was starting to rely on her judgment, the way he had once relied on Bora Shin's. He was trusting her, and he hadn't asked himself yet whether that was exactly what she wanted. 3 days into the silent audit, Layla found something that stopped her cold. Not Bora Shin. She had expected Bora Shin. His betrayal was already mapped, already contained. What she hadn't expected was what her surveillance pulled from Do-hyun Seo's private financial records. The paper-thin man from the third family. The one who had laughed 2 seconds too late at every joke. Turns out Do-hyun Seo wasn't just a representative. He was the money. For 4 months before the summit, Seo had been routing funds to Cheol Ryong's network. Disguised as infrastructure maintenance payments, cycling through 3 shell companies and a logistics firm registered in Busan. Clean on the surface, invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. But Layla had been specifically looking. And what she found underneath those payments was the detail that changed the entire shape of the story. Do-hyun Seo's financial trail didn't just connect to the assassination network. It connected to a name inside Prosecutor Kwok's own office, an intelligence asset. Someone embedded within the federal investigation itself, who had been feeding syndicate-side operatives information about Kwok's case structure for over a year. This was no longer a Mafia betrayal. This was a systemic operation designed to collapse Kwok's 7-year case from the inside, to guarantee that no syndicate boss ever felt safe enough to cooperate with federal investigation again. Layla brought every piece of it directly to Kwok. Laid it out the same way she had laid everything out. Clean. Fast. No softening. Kwok went completely still. And then she told Layla that nothing had changed. That Layla's role was to keep Kyung-jun alive and available. That the internal asset was a matter for the prosecutor's office to handle through its own channels. Layla walked out of that office and stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was all it took to understand what Kwok's non-answer actually meant. Kwok already knew, and that single realization cracked the foundation of everything Layla had been operating on. Bora Shin had been quiet for 4 days. Too quiet. A man like Bora Shin, 11 years building power inside the most disciplined syndicate in Korea, now watching his assassination attempt dissolve into silence without a single consequence, does not sit still. Silence, for a man like him, was never patience. It was preparation. On the 5th day, he moved. He pushed coded messages through a back channel to the representatives of the 2 smaller families, implying that Kyung-jun was compromised, that federal surveillance had the penthouse footage from the night of the summit, that the consolidation deal was already being used as evidence in an active prosecution. The message was precise, credible, and designed to trigger exactly one response: withdrawal. Within 6 hours, both families initiated quiet communications about dissolving their commitments. 18 months of negotiation, 4 intermediaries, 2 disappearances, and Bora Shin was dismantling all of it with a message he sent from a burner phone in under 3 minutes. No one had prepared for how fast it nearly worked, however. And this is the part that nobody in that room saw coming. Layla had already been inside that channel for 48 hours. She had intercepted it the moment Bora Shin accessed it. And before his messages ever reached the 2 families, she had replaced 3 of them with altered versions, neutralizing the specific details that would have triggered withdrawal, redirecting the tone from alarm to routine confirmation. The 2 families never panicked, because they never received the message Bora Shin actually sent. When Kyung-jun found out, not from Layla, but from a lieutenant who had stumbled onto the discrepancy in the channel logs, he summoned her immediately. He asked her one question: why hadn't she told him? She looked at him evenly and said, because a collapsing empire is no use to anyone. Kyung-jun said nothing for a long time after that, because he understood. With the cold clarity of a man who had just been outmaneuvered cleanly, that she hadn't protected his empire out of loyalty. She had protected it because it still had a purpose to serve. His survival was a resource, and she was managing it. She didn't ask for permission, didn't warn him, just moved, and saved his entire empire in silence while he didn't even know it was falling apart. So let me ask you something directly. At what point did Layla stop being the hero of this story and start being the most dangerous person in it? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because where this goes next, you are not ready. Bora Shin made his final move on a Tuesday night. He reached out to Kyung-jun directly, calm, respectful, the tone of a loyal man offering a private meeting to reaffirm his commitment after a turbulent week. A Port District warehouse, minimal security, just the two of them and a small trusted circle. Everything about it read like loyalty. Every single thing about it was a trap. Bora Shin had 8 armed men already positioned inside that warehouse before Kyung-jun ever received the message. The plan was clean. Make it look like a rival family ambush. Eliminate Kyung-jun in a location with no surveillance, and walk back into the hierarchy as the grieving enforcer who arrived too late to stop it. It was the most direct, most lethal trap Kyung-jun had ever been handed. He walked straight into it, because Layla told him to. At this point, you're probably thinking that was the most reckless decision of his life. It wasn't. It was the most calculated one. Because Layla had been inside Bora Shin's communication network long enough to know exactly what was waiting in that warehouse, and she had already made a call of her own. Prosecutor Kwok's plainclothes tactical unit was already positioned at the port when Kyung-jun arrived, not to arrest him. Kwok needed him walking and breathing. They were there for one target only: Bora Shin's armed network. The moment Bora Shin triggered the ambush, he triggered his own arrest instead. In one operation, Layla had dismantled the assassination network, delivered actionable arrests to Kwok's 7-year case, and kept her word to Kyung-jun. All without firing a single shot, raising a single alarm, or stepping inside that warehouse herself. Bora Shin was taken. Do-hyun Seo, however, was already gone. And that disappearance, quiet, surgical, perfectly timed, was the detail that told Layla the story wasn't over. It was just moving to a different level. She set a trap inside a trap, and walked away clean while 2 of the most dangerous men in Korea got exactly what she designed for them. No gun, no badge, no backup anyone knew about. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, you are genuinely missing the most calculated storytelling we have ever put out. Hit subscribe right now. Because what Do-hyun Seo does next is the part of this story that nobody talks about, and we are not slowing down. After Bora Shin's arrest, the empire went quiet. Not the dangerous kind of quiet. The kind that follows an explosion, where everyone is still checking whether they still have all their limbs. This was a different quiet, deliberate, the kind powerful men use to reassess everything they thought they knew. Kyung-jun requested one final meeting with Layla before he moved into the next phase of restructuring his hierarchy. She agreed. Same sterile location she always chose. Same stillness she always carried into a room. He sat across from her and asked the only honest question he had asked anyone in 30 years. What do you want? Not what does Kwok want. Not what does the investigation need. What do you? Layla Osei Jackson, the woman who had repositioned every piece on his board without his permission. What do you actually want out of this? She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she told him. She wanted the name. The specific name that Kwok's embedded intelligence asset reported to, inside the Ministry of Justice. That name connected upward to something neither Kwok's case nor Kyung-jun's empire had ever mapped. Something larger than both of them combined. It wasn't leverage. It wasn't a trade. It was a direction. Kyung-jun studied her for a long time across that table. This was the moment. Later, people who knew pieces of this story would call it the only gift he ever gave freely, where he made a choice that had nothing to do with strategy. He gave her the name, not out of gratitude, out of the first genuine respect he had extended to another person in 30 years. And the moment he said it out loud, both of them understood the story had just grown significantly more dangerous. Layla walked into Prosecutor Kwok's office with the name. She laid it on the desk the same way she laid everything. Clean, direct, no ceremony. The name belonged to a deputy director inside the Ministry of Justice, a man Kwok worked beneath for 6 years, deferred to, never once challenged. A man whose approval Kwok needed to advance every major prosecution her office had ever filed. Kwok looked at the name for a long time. And then she did something that told Layla everything. She went completely still. Not the stillness of shock, not the stillness of someone processing new information. This was the stillness of someone managing their reaction. The controlled freeze of a person who already knows what they're looking at and is calculating how to respond to the person watching them. Kwok had known. Not everything, but enough. She had known the internal asset existed, known it connected upward, and had made a deliberate choice to protect the political architecture of her case over exposing the rot inside her own building. What happened next became the moment Layla stopped working for anyone but herself. Kwok closed the folder, told Layla her access to the case was formally suspended. Her role had been fulfilled. Kyung-jun was alive. The assassination network was dismantled. Bora Shin was in custody. The investigation would proceed through official channels from this point forward. It was a clean dismissal dressed as gratitude. Layla walked out without a word. But she had photographed Kwok's reaction the moment she laid that name on the desk, not with a camera. She didn't need one anymore. She had read every microshift in Kwok's face and filed it with the same precision she used on everything else. And she still had the name. No badge, no employer, no institutional protection of any kind. Just the name. And the absolute clarity of someone who finally understood the full shape of the board she was standing on. Do-hyun Seo surfaced 9 days after Bora Shin's arrest. Not publicly. Not through any channel Kwok's office monitored. He surfaced through a back-channel message routed to Layla directly, which itself told her 2 things immediately. First, he had been watching her movements long enough to know she was no longer operating under Kwok's protection. Second, he was desperate enough to reach out anyway. His offer was straightforward. Full documentation of the Ministry Assets Network. Names, transaction records, communication logs. The complete architecture of everything connecting Do-hyun Seo's financial operation to the Deputy Director's office, in exchange for protection from 2 threats closing in on him simultaneously. Kyung-jun's remaining loyalists, who held Seo responsible for the summit's near collapse, and Kwok's office, which had a sealed warrant with his name on it. At this point, you're probably thinking Layla walked away from that offer immediately. She didn't, because the documentation Seo was describing, if authentic, was the single piece of evidence capable of exposing the ministry connection that Kwok had deliberately buried. It was the key to the entire operation. However, authenticating it required resources Layla no longer had access to through official channels. She needed the syndicate's deep financial forensics unit, the same apparatus Kyung-jun used to verify the legitimacy of every major transaction his empire touched. She went back to Kyung-jun, not for protection, not for permission, for one specific tool. He agreed, not out of trust, out of shared interest. Do-hyun Seo's documentation implicated people who threatened the stability of Kyung-jun's restructured hierarchy just as directly as it threatened Layla's mission. This became known as the Unspoken Alliance. 3 people in 3 different rooms, connected by one document none of them fully trusted, moving toward the same target for entirely different reasons. Nobody in that arrangement was honest with the others. That was precisely what made it functional. Do-hyun Seo's documents were authentic. Every record, every transaction, every name. Kyung-jun's forensics unit spent 11 hours cross-referencing the financial trails against known syndicate payment architecture, and came back with a single, unambiguous conclusion. The documentation was real, and what it revealed didn't just implicate the deputy director inside the Ministry of Justice. It rewrote the entire story from the beginning. The Siorax Summit had not been a natural development. It had been engineered. Someone inside the ministry, working through the deputy director's office, had spent 14 months quietly facilitating the conditions that brought all 3 rival syndicate families to that penthouse, resolving territorial disputes that had festered for years, removing specific obstacles that had previously blocked negotiation, creating, with surgical patience, a single unified syndicate target that could be monitored under one roof, leveraged under one hierarchy, and eventually dismantled under one coordinated federal operation. The consolidation wasn't Kyung-jun's victory. It was their blueprint. But that wasn't even the most devastating part. The assassination attempt. Bora Shin's contract. Cheol Ryong on the ledge. The entire operation Layla had dismantled with a camera flash. Was not designed to kill Kyung-jun permanently. It was a pressure test. A deliberate stress event introduced into the newly unified hierarchy to measure whether it would hold under crisis, fracture along family lines, or collapse entirely. They needed to know the structure's breaking point before they triggered the real operation against it. They weren't eliminating the empire. They were testing it for weaknesses before they took it apart piece by piece. And Layla, placed inside the summit by Kwok, positioned as a control variable within the test environment, had been part of the design without knowing it. At this point, you're probably feeling exactly what Layla felt when those documents finished printing. Not anger, not fear. The specific, cold clarity of someone who finally sees the entire board for the first time and realizes they have been a piece on it from the very beginning. This was the moment that reframed everything that came before it. Every chapter, every move, every choice. All of it had been happening inside someone else's architecture. She didn't stumble into this story. She was placed into it. The rescue, the flash, the safe house meetings, all of it unfolded inside a blueprint she didn't write. So tell me something in the comments, and be completely honest. Did you see this coming? Or did this story just flip everything you thought you understood? Because the people saying they called it from the beginning. I don't believe you. And the ones who didn't, welcome to the real story. It gets worse from here. Layla had 72 hours. That was the window. The gap between the moment Kyung-jun's forensics unit authenticated Seo's documents and the moment the deputy director's office would detect that its network had been accessed and begin closing every trail connected to it. 72 hours to move all 3 plays simultaneously before the entire operation went dark. She didn't hesitate. The first move, she pulled a curated package of financial evidence, clean, irrefutable, impossible to suppress quietly, and delivered it to an independent investigative journalist she had worked with 3 years before the summit. Someone with no political ties, no institutional allegiance, and a track record of publishing exactly what powerful people needed buried. The story was scheduled to break within 48 hours, regardless of what happened to Layla afterward. The second move, she sent Kyung-jun a complete briefing, not a summary. Everything. The full architecture of the ministry's involvement, the 14 months of manufactured conditions, the pressure test, the blueprint. For the first time since the night of the summit, Kyung-jun Choi saw the complete picture of the board he had been a piece on. The third move was the one nobody saw coming. She sent prosecutor Kwok a single audio file. It was a recording of Kwok's own voice from a conversation 6 months prior, in which Kwok explicitly acknowledged the existence of the internal ministry asset and made a deliberate decision to protect the political viability of her case over exposing it. Not a leak, not a threat, a mirror. Kwok had built 7 years of prosecution on the principle of institutional accountability. Layla handed her that principle, pointed directly back at her own reflection. Every player was now exposed. Every player knew it. And every player understood that the next 48 hours would determine not just who survived, but who got to control the version of events the world eventually believed. This became known simply as the reckoning window, and nobody slept through it. The story broke on a Wednesday morning, not through Kwok's office, not through any official channel, through a 47-page investigative report published by a journalist with no institutional allegiance and nothing to lose, carrying financial records, communication logs, and a 14-month paper trail that connected the deputy director's office directly to the manufactured conditions of the Siorax Summit. By noon, the deputy director had submitted his resignation. By evening, prosecutor Kwok had been placed under internal review and quietly reassigned pending investigation. The woman who had spent 7 years building a case against the Korean underworld became, in the space of one Wednesday, the subject of one herself. Do-hyun Seo was arrested Thursday. The timing was so precise, so perfectly threaded between the collapse of his protection networks and the closing of his escape routes, that the investigators who executed the warrant privately admitted it felt less like a capture and more like a delivery. Someone had timed it for them. Nobody could prove who. Kyungjun's consolidated hierarchy held, damaged, restructured, stripped of 2 lieutenants and 1 enforcer, but intact. He was not grateful. Gratitude was not a language he had ever learned. Instead, he felt something rarer and far more uncomfortable for a man like him. Humility. 30 years of certainty. The absolute, unshakable belief that he was the most dangerous person in every room he entered, quietly dismantled by a woman with a camera and 17 moves he never saw coming. However, the most important detail of everything that followed was also the smallest one. Layla was already gone. Different city, different cover organization, different camera. A new case file open on a desk somewhere, with a single line at the top that told anyone who knew how to read it exactly what was coming next. Assets embedded. 1. She never looked back. She never needed to. She walked into that penthouse invisible. She walked out having moved every single piece on the board. The boss, the enforcer, the prosecutor, the ministry, all of it. And not one person watched her do it. That is the rarest kind of power that exists. This channel finds these stories, builds them exactly like Layla does, layer by layer, with nothing wasted, and delivers them to the people paying close enough attention to find them. If you are not subscribed yet, you are already behind. Hit subscribe right now, because the next story we are building makes this one look like the opening move.